Hi, Jeff Munn, Creating Extraordinary Futures. I thought I'd take some time today to talk about lineage and history and story. I get questions from time to time about how I got on this path, about who I've studied with, about time frames, all that stuff. And it goes back a long ways, and I don't often get a chance to tell the full story, and I thought I'd just post it. So, as a way to send a link to someone if they want it, as a way, if you found this, obviously you're interested in it, and I'll go back to the beginning, and I'd say if I go back all the way to the beginning, I was kind of a stressed out mess for a long time in my adolescence, in my teen, late teen years in college, in law school, even early in my career as a lawyer. And it was everything from panic attacks to excessive perspiration to just a walking around with this just this general feeling of clamminess and always being on edge and always thinking that the world was looking at me in these judgmental ways, and just making up a lot of really horrible stories about the lack of safety in the world. And we can go back to my mom and her history and all of that if we really want to, but I'm going to try to make this about me. So the first breakthrough that I had with this idea that maybe it doesn't have to be this way, was that after a vacation in Thailand that my first wife and I took in Christmas time of 1995, I decided I was going to start meditating. And I did begin to meditate, and it was while my wife was pregnant with our daughter, who's now 25. So, more than 25 years ago. And it took some time to take. Most people stop meditating pretty quickly because it's hard to sit with your thoughts. It's hard to sit in knowing that there's silence out there, and that in here is way more active than we ever really knew because we never really paid attention to it. But as it turned out, my wife was had a difficult pregnancy and was going to bed 8:30 every night, and before I would turn the TV on, I would meditate for. At first it was 10 minutes, then 15, and it gradually got longer. And over the course of her pregnancy, that's 9 months of meditating. And at that point, the thought of going back to that, the thought of going back to not meditating, it just wasn't going to happen for me. So I stuck with that, and I got interested in technologies around how to deepen my meditation. And so there was a technology, it still exists now, but it was kind of all the rage for a while, called Binaural Beats, where you would wear headphones, and one headphone would play an audio signal and the other would play a slightly different audio signal. And there were interference patterns that were created. That the theory goes at the time, and I think they proved it was actually true. I know it certainly seemed to make my meditation more effective. That your brain would resonate with these interference patterns, and so it would guide your brain to certain meditative states. Alpha waves, which is just generally this calm presence. You're certainly more creative and present when you're in alpha, but then you can go into other states, and I forget what the theta is the next one, which is a little bit slower. Delta is like deep sleep, but you can theoretically get to delta even while you're awake with the assistance of these technologies. And that ability to learn and feel into those states, I began to have the capacity to do that more and more when I wasn't meditating as well. And so I started being able to bring in this capacity to be calm and present more and more into my life, more and more into my working life, into my personal life. I also started discovering things about myself that I really didn't know, things that I liked about myself and didn't like about myself, things that I liked about my relationship and didn't like about my relationship. And ultimately, and that's a story way outside of the scope of this video, but ultimately after we moved to Washington, D.C., and, I was in Chicago through the 90s, and we moved to D.C. in 2000, and in 2002 we broke up, and that there was this itch, this curiosity, to go to retreats, things that I hadn't done while I was married. I now had a little more time and a little more, faith in myself, capacity to say that I wanted this. I mean, all of this was developing, right? I started getting interested in retreats, and one of the first 2 or 3 retreats, I think it was 3, were by an organization called the Monroe Institute, which not so coincidentally had produced CDs with the audio technology that I was talking about, and their founder, a guy named Robert Monroe, who died a long time ago. I think he died in before 2000. I think like the mid 90s. He had discovered that he could use these technologies to have out of body experiences, and I was kind of interested in that. I was really more interested in just like a deeper kind of sense of who I was spiritually, who I was behind the personality and the neurotic habits. And one of their things was, the only thing that Robert Monroe ever asked people to believe was that they were more than their physical body. And so I did 2 or 3 of those retreats. They had a profound impact on me over the next few years. And the way I've found this in my life is that I would find a thing and I would explore that thing, and then I'd feel like, I think I've gotten what I came to get from that. And then I would take a break and probably spend some time integrating that, and then something else would show up. And so my last, I think I did the Monroe retreats 2005 and 2006. And then in 2007, I was in a bookstore. And that bookstore, it was the Barnes & Noble in Rockville, Maryland. And I was walking around the spiritual section. I was constantly, seeking things in the spiritual section of the bookstore. And I saw this book that I hadn't seen before. And interestingly enough, I not only hadn't seen it before, I bought the only copy that they had. Maybe they had 2. But after I bought it, I never saw it again in that bookstore. So one of those weird moments. And the book was called Radiant Mind, and it was by a man named Peter Fenner. And Peter Fenner had created a program, a year, well, yeah, roughly a year, little less. A year-long program that he called Radiant Mind. He actually wrote the book after he had been offering this program for several years. And it was a westernized version of Tibetan Buddhism, and some of the more esoteric parts of Tibetan Buddhism go by the name Dzogchen and Mahamudra. What I would later learn were called either direct path or non-dual paths of Buddhism. And I later learned that every religion has direct non-dual traditions within it. They tend to be rather esoteric, rather not as well known, because they're not about following rules. They're not about the 10 Commandments. They're not about these are the habits you need to have in order to be a successful, qualified Buddhist or Muslim or Christian or Jew. They were more about the direct experience. You know, sometimes it'd say the direct experience of God. I tended to think of it more as like a deeper experience of myself. And so after I read Radiant Mind, and after I got a sense of, you know, Peter's background and had a couple conversations with him, went out on YouTube, watched the stuff that I could find on Peter, and just really resonated with him and what he was offering. Australian by birth, had been a Tibetan Buddhist monk for 9 years, gave up his robes to get married, but continued to study and think about how can I take these concepts, precepts, you know, directional pointings, whatever you want to call them, and make them more available to more people, make them more accessible to Westerners. I knew after reading the book I wanted to do the program, and I signed up for it, and I went in. I think the program that I did started in the fall. If I remember right, it was the fall of 2008. And I'll do a little sidebar, and then I'll come back. The sidebar that is that there was a man in the program named Robert Kirby, and Robert Kirby was a publisher, and one of the authors that he published, the man who had actually encouraged him to go to the program, was a man named Michael Neal, which much later in the story had a profound influence on me and continues to influence me. And Michael had gone through Radiant Mind, whatever year I went through it. I think it was 2008 in Boulder. Michael had gone through it in California in 2007. So I ended up spending 3 years with Peter Fenner, first going through the program, second and third as, I think he used the term mentor the second year, and he actually used the term coach the third year, helping provide closer guidance than Peter could provide, because there were about 50 people going through this program every year. They would offer several students who had gone through the program before as a resource to the people going through the program. And that was really my first opportunity to think about, there was something you could call coaching, or something that was approximating coaching, that looked like, if you can show someone how to experience the world at a slightly deeper level, their lives will shift automatically without them having to try, really. It's like, if you see the world differently, you do different things, and it's automatic. And so I first got that inkling, that sense of that possibility, because of the work that I did with Peter, and I'm incredibly grateful for it. So my time with Peter finished up in 2011, because I went through three years of program. The first 2 in Boulder, the last one in Vancouver. And then I took another break. I felt like I had done what I needed to do with Peter. I felt like there was a lot to integrate, and there was this deepening curiosity around Michael Neal, and Michael had written a couple books, and had begun to study this thing called the 3 Principles. It went by a bunch of names: the 3 Principles, the Inside Out Understanding, and it went back to the Enlightenment experience of a Scottish welder living in Canada named Sid Banks. And Sid Banks began to talk about this fundamental insight he had had into the nature of reality, and how each of us is creating our reality moment by moment through the power of thought. That is how there's this universal creative capacity, this universal intelligence that is producing everything moment by moment. And that Sid called mind. There is this universal capacity that we have as humans to experience the world, and he called that consciousness. And then there is this universal experience that we have of creating our world moment by moment, inside our own heads, right? We have no direct way to experience the world other than through our thinking. So however our sense organs work, and that information is converted into electrical impulses that our brains turn into sights and sounds and tastes and smells. And then there's the running commentary that we tell ourselves about whether we like this particular sight or sound or smell, or energy form appearing as a human being or an animal, or story, completely conceptual, made up things like trust and honesty and money. That's all internal, right? And so that understanding, Sid started talking about that, and didn't even use those terms at first, but people just liked listening to Sid. They knew he got life on a level that they didn't. He became a teacher, and a lot of his initial students just coincidentally were psychologists, and a lot of those psychologists ended up teaching other psychologists, becoming coaches, beginning to see that they, even though they hadn't had as fundamental an awakening or an experience as Sid, that they could share this with other people and they would get it on some level, and that their lives would improve because they had gotten it. And this isn't what Sid was talking about. He used different language, but it was, you can go back 5,000 years to spiritual teachers from all traditions, and they've all been pointing at this. They've all been pointing at this fundamental okayness that we have, this unlimited capacity that we have because we are connected to this greater intelligence. This idea that we're not fundamentally flawed, but actually we're fundamentally perfect. We only have the capacity to see that we're not that. We can kind of make up a story that we're not, but that's a made up story. And so that, as I think about it, the next person that I saw connected, I wasn't quite ready to pursue coaching with a capital C yet and really kind of jump in. Michael Neal had this program that he called Super Coach that was a year long. It was 4 weekends. There was lots of travel. There was lots of work, and it was relatively expensive. It was just more money than I was willing to kind of lay out at that time. I wasn't quite sure I was 100% in. But somehow there was another teacher within this universe who offered a little bit smaller kind of package, but it appeared to be just as deep. A man named Jack Pransky, who again, I can't remember exactly how I got connected to Jack, other than it was clear that he was kind of in this inner circle of people who had worked directly with Sid Banks. And he was offering what he called a professional training. It wasn't specifically about becoming a coach. It was more about how do you talk to people about this thing called the 3 principles, or this thing called the inside out understanding, and how do you get more clear in that? And I thought, wow, he'd be great to work with one-on-one. And I called him up. I was living in DC at the time. This was 2014. I was living in DC at the time. He was living in New Hampshire, I think. And I was working, at the time I was working at a company called Health Dialogue. No, I had moved to Fidelity. I was working at Fidelity at that point. So I was in Boston all the time. And I thought, well, I'll just, I'll go up to Boston. I'll take a couple of days off. I'll drive to see Jack from Boston. And I called up Jack to offer that, to say I wanted to do that. And he said, basically, I'm getting closer and closer to being retired at this point. I think he was real close to 70 at that point. But I do these extended professional trainings, and I would love to have you be part of it. I think you'd be great. And it's in Spain. And so the only way for me to work with Jack Pransky, who I thought I was just going to drive to from Boston, was to fly to Spain. And so I did that in October of 2014, and then again in May of 2015. I flew to Spain for several days and had an amazing experience with about 12 people. I believe I was the only American besides Jack. But people had come from all over Europe. And it was really about exploring this this inside-out understanding at a deeper and deeper level. And a lot of it was beyond the words. It was about recognizing the grounding of the person who was sharing it. And that sat with me for a long time. And interestingly enough, when I became a coach, I did not think I could be a coach from that perspective. I had an experience with Jack in Spain in May, I think, of 2015, where a group of us it was like the last day, our last day together in the program, and we were sitting in a room together in like a hotel kind of conference room. And it was totally quiet. And there was, in my world, in my created world in that moment, I just saw everything is, not only is everything okay, everything's perfect. Everything is exactly as it needs to be in this moment, in every moment. And that wasn't the first time I had had that kind of insight or feeling. I've been having them along the way. The first time really was 2007 when I'd been reading Peter's book and I was meditating, and it just hit me, this really profound and really simple thing. Like, oh, the present is all there is. The present moment, that's it. That's all we ever have. We're making up everything else. And this was like that, but, and I'm making this up, but like it just hit me at a little bit deeper level. Because even though we're making stuff up, it seemed necessary to make it up. And now in this particular moment, it was like, I'm not sure I need to. So that's 2014. And I've worked with people since then. When I got laid off from Fidelity in 2016, one of the first things I did was I did a coaching intensive with Rich Litvin, a very well-respected teacher, fantastic teacher of coaches. And in particular, his focus is on how do you build up a practice as a coach. And it, I worked with Rich at a couple intensives, and the intensives are large, 150 people. And then in a small group, 7 people for 6 months, week after week after week, really looking at our own assumptions about how we could help people or how we couldn't help people or who we wanted to work with. And it was really foundational for me as I discovered who I wanted to help in the world. And a lot of it was, senior executives who had this broader influence. They could create the culture at their company. They could change the culture at their company. They could change direction, and it would have this downstream positive impact on their customers and their employees. And I began to work with people who really believed, as I do, that in order to become a better leader, you know, the more fundamental question is, how are you becoming a better human? And what does that look like for you?